Continuing my series on dungeon design, I'm going to give you 6 steps to help you build a dungeon. And then I'm going to give you 6 different steps to help you build a dungeon. And then we're going to look at the secret synergy between those 2 sets of steps, followed by 6 examples from classic adventures and Shadowdark adventures that'll help you really understand the best way to go about creating a dungeon for you and your games. Now, in my most popular video, I talk about how to build a village, and in that approach, I specifically look at ways to make your village gameable. What are the things as a dungeon master you want to put in your village in order to make the village as gameable, as usable by your players as possible? I've had comments on that video with other suggestions and other approaches, and you certainly can do what I call the butcher, baker, candlestick maker approach. And that's a much more realistic way to go about building a village, town, or city. That ground up resource management. How did they get here? What are they doing with those resources? And how are they growing those resources? Now, when it comes to dungeon design, you have essentially those same 2 choices. The gameable approach or the realistic approach. So for the sake of this video, let's start with our realistic approach. Now, when it comes to my realistic approach, I often think about the boss or the theme of the dungeon. Who is the big bad that lives in this dungeon, and how do they impact that space? And a lot of times that's pretty easy to do with 5th edition D&D because legendary monsters have regional effects. And you can take ideas from those regional effects and the monster's legendary actions and work those into the dungeon itself, or the surrounding area of the dungeon. That's the purpose of those regional effects in the monster manual. So when you're designing a dungeon with a big bad like a black dragon or an aboleth or a mummy lord, you can look at those legendary actions and those regional effects, and then you decide how that impacts the dungeon itself. And that can also establish a theme. Now, your dungeon doesn't have to have a boss, and it doesn't have to have a boss in order to have a theme. In fact, if you don't have a boss, I would recommend creating a theme for the dungeon. Now, theme could be something as simple as Savage, the violent, vicious orcs of the caverns of Morgor. I don't know what the name of the caverns are. Your theme could be darkness and decay. Your theme could be ooze and gross. Your theme could be bizarre and weird. Like, whatever you pick as the theme of your dungeon can help set a tone. The next tip is origin. Who was the creator of the dungeon and what was the dungeon's original purpose? How did it get here and what was it used for? And that can inform the architecture and the layout and the original design of the dungeon itself. And that helps you make design choices when you're creating your map for your dungeon or when you're creating your traps. Having a clear origin helps you make informed decisions moving forward. So the next tip is history. How did it go from its origin to the condition that's in now? How did it go from dwarven fortress to crumbling ruin? How did it go from elvish temple to infested with kobolds and goblins? How did it go from the palace of a genie to the home of a hag coven? What is its history? How did it get from here to there? And how does that now inform our next tip, which is inhabitants? So if it went from a palace of a genie to a hag coven, what happened in between? And are there any of those inhabitants still there? So let's take that palace, for example. If it used to belong to a djinn, an air genie, then there's probably air elementals still living and roaming about the ruins of the palace. And if the hags have moved in and made that their home, well, hags often have minions of their own. So maybe the hags have a group of kobolds that are working for them. But how do the hags maintain authority over the kobolds? Well, maybe they have a illusionary dragon because kobolds like to worship dragons. So the hags have created this illusion of a sleeping blue dragon, and they use the air elementals that were left behind by the genie to create mysterious magical effects that scare the kobolds into submission. Likewise, the hags then take those air elementals and use them to affect the weather of the nearby village. So the villagers, now superstitious from the terrible weather, offer sacrifices to the god of storms in order to protect their village from the terrible weather conditions that can arrive. So the hags have basically manipulated the kobolds and the village using the power of these air elementals and the magic that was left over by this genie. That's a way that you connect your origin, your history, and your inhabitants. Now, if you're familiar with this channel, then you're probably aware of my Get Even campaign prep process. And at the core of that are the 4 feuding factions. And that's a design principle where you take 4-corner opposition, a storytelling device, and you use that with 4 different factions in your campaign in order to create verisimilitude and a feeling of a living, breathing world. However, you can take that same idea of using factions and bring it down into a smaller area of the dungeon itself. And you can have different factions in your dungeon. We've already established this example dungeon with hags and air elementals and kobolds. Maybe we add a 4th faction to this dungeon, and we'll say there's a group of troglodytes that are crawling up out of the tunnels beneath the hags, and they are trying to eke out their own existence as they've been displaced from the Underdark by a group of drow. Now we have multiple factions at play, and there's a lot of tension that we can get out of the dungeon, and players could actually start to manipulate one faction against the other, maybe turning the troglodytes against the hags, or maybe proving to the kobolds that the dragon is an illusion and the hags have been tricking them this whole time. I don't know, you tell me in the comments below what you think of this dungeon so far and how you might play these factions against each other, whether you're the DM or a player in that scenario. Now, the last thing on our realistic list is the ecosystem. How do these creatures manage to survive in this environment? What is their food source? What is their water source? In fact, in this situation, we have air elementals, and maybe those air elementals provide a valuable resource. There's a lot of ideas you could come up with. In fact, you could have a dungeon that's nothing but unintelligent monsters that are essentially their own ecosystem, a food chain, where one monster eats another, and that monster eats another, and at the top of the food chain is some sort of alpha predator that feeds on all the rest. Now, your players might not figure all this out. They might not discover the intricacies of your food chain or your ecosystem. However, they will get a sense of verisimilitude, a sense of realism in that world where things start to make sense and it feels lived in. It feels realistic. So that's our realistic list, and let's pull it up on the screen so you can see all 6 of those steps. Now we're going to compare those 6 steps to the 6 gameable steps. And now our gameable steps include combat, roleplay, investigation and exploration, traps and puzzles, set pieces, and rewards. So as you can see, these 6 steps take into account the different styles of play. But here's where we get the secret sauce. What if we take the realism list on the left and the gameable list on the right, and we look for ways to combine those? We design a room in a dungeon that combines one thing off of each list. So we can have a roleplay encounter that reinforces the theme. We can have a set piece in the dungeon that shows off the origin. We can have traps and puzzles that are connected to the history of the dungeon. Our inhabitants can move about the dungeon in a way that inspires investigation and exploration by the players. The factions can give rewards to the player characters for fighting the other factions. You can even find ways to connect the ecosystem to combat. For example, our air elementals are an important part of this crumbling palace ecosystem, but they also provide interesting combat encounters. The players might fight these flying air elementals in a vertical space of one of the palace's old towers, creating an interesting dynamic combat encounter. So at this point, I think you get the idea, and you can see how you can combine one thing from each list, and that gives you a 6-room dungeon that has both the verisimilitude and gameplay in mind, which is perfect for a 5th edition adventure because dungeons tend to be smaller, and dungeons typically have a tighter narrative in more modern style games. But if you're designing a more old school game for Shadowdark or OSE, You could take each of these things on each of these lists and combine them, and that would give you 36 different rooms that both reflect the verisimilitude and potential style of gameplay. And furthermore, you could extrapolate it up from there if you want to make a mega dungeon with 60 or 90 or 120 rooms. You can just keep making it bigger and bigger using this formula over and over again. Now, before we go, let me give you some more concrete examples from some classic dungeon adventures. The Precipice of Corruption is a dungeon crawl classic adventure written by Nick Barron, and it has a great grimdark feel, which is a perfect example of combining theme with roleplay. So grimdark is clearly the theme of this dungeon. However, that theme is reinforced of the roleplay in the starting village. The starting village is full of starving, hateful, paranoid people who all blame each other for the town's trials and tribulations. This actually motivates the players to get out of the town and go on the adventure, because the only people in the town that have tried to fix the problem are the hunters who've gone out looking for food, and those hunters have gone missing. So the players feel this odd pressure to get out of town because the NPCs in town are so annoyingly dark that they want to get out there and find the people who have any sort of hope. And this is just a great example of how to connect roleplay to theme. The next example is White Plume Mountain, and this is a classic AD&D adventure written by Lawrence Schick. This sets up a gonzo funhouse dungeon with a number of cool set pieces that are part of the wizard's strange strategy for keeping adventurers away from his magical treasures. For example, there's a chasm with a number of large wooden discs hanging from big chains, and the only way to get across the chasm is to jump on one disc and swing to the next and to the next to get across this chasm. It seems a lot more like a sequence from a platforming video game, but it's right here in the middle of this crazy funhouse dungeon. And there's this weird inverted ziggurat that's like a zoo holding a variety of different types of magical creatures. So these set pieces have no realistic reason for existence other than the origin story that they were created by a weird wizard. And that's just enough to suspend disbelief and make this crazy adventure believable. Now, the next example is combining history with your traps and puzzles. The history of the dungeon can largely inform the types of traps that are going to be in it. Now, Sunless Citadel is a 3rd edition adventure that is a great example of that. It's a temple built by elves to worship an evil dragon that has fallen into decay and ruin. There was a member of the dragon cult that turned himself into a troll and was therefore imprisoned and punished by the rest of the cult. So this troll has been locked away and essentially becomes a trap if your players accidentally release him. Likewise, there's 2 draconic fountains that create magic potions. Well, at least they used to. One of them is now broken, so when you activate the fountain, it no longer creates a potion, but instead releases poisonous gas. So these are effectively traps, but they weren't intended to be by the original design. But they become traps because their original reason for existing are lost in history. The next example is how inhabitants of the dungeon can affect exploration. And a good example of that is the Citadel of the Scarlet Minotaur, which is a Shadowdark adventure by Kelsey Dion. There's a group of beastmen that live in the Citadel, and they only move about the dungeon through secret passages. These secret passages used to be discreet service tunnels when the Citadel was in its full glory. But the beastmen who use these tunnels now are afraid to go anywhere else in the dungeon because of the Minotaur and because of legends of dragons in the greater world outside. And that shows you how the inhabitants of the dungeon and the way they move about the dungeon can inform the player's choices as to how they explore and interact with the dungeon. Now, the next example is from the Shadowdark zine called The Red Sands, and the dungeon in the Red Sands is called the Iron Fortress. And in that Iron Fortress are 2 brothers, and those brothers are at odds with each other, and each one commands its own faction. And there's an iron golem in this dungeon. Depending on how the players respond to the 2 different factions and what the players do with some particular magic items will determine the fate of that iron golem, or or the fate of the individual that Iron Golem is set to destroy. Now, our last example shows how an ecosystem can inform the combat encounters of a dungeon. And the dungeon that really illustrates that is Bittermold Keep, which comes from the Curse Scroll number 1 in the Shadowdark series of zines. Bittermold Keep fell victim to a primordial ooze named Mugdleblub, and this terrible creature has slowly corrupted everything that lives inside this keep, both creature and humanoid. So you can see how this unnatural ecosystem leads to a series of combat encounters. In the intro, I said I was going to give you the best way to build a dungeon, and ultimately, the best way to build a dungeon is how you think about dungeons and how you get your creative juices flowing and what is the most intuitive method for you. So hopefully you can use either of these two approaches, the realistic approach or the gameable approach, or use that synergy like I do to combine those two approaches. But however you go about doing it, feel encouraged and feel motivated to keep making cool content for your games and sharing it with your friends, because that's ultimately the greatest thing about this hobby, is having fun with the people we enjoy having fun with. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time in the Dire Den. In the meantime, check out these videos, and if you haven't already, subscribe. Now's your chance to put Dire Den over the 5,000 mark.